It is 4:47 in the morning on March 3rd, 2026. The Persian Gulf is pitch black, and somewhere in the darkness, a cargo ship carrying 23,000 containers of medicine, electronics, and food has come to a complete stop. The captain has cut the engines. He's not waiting for weather. He's not waiting for a dock. He's waiting because 40 miles ahead of him, the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important waterway in the entire global economy, has effectively ceased to exist. Armed Iranian patrol boats are circling. Missiles have already struck 2 tankers in the last 6 hours. And on the bridge of that cargo ship, the captain picks up his satellite phone, calls his company's headquarters in Hamburg, and says 4 words that are about to reverberate across every supermarket, every gas station, every stock exchange, and every government treasury on the planet. He says, "We are turning back." That moment, right there at 4:47 a.m. on March 3rd, 2026, is the moment the world economy quietly cracked. Not broke, not yet, but cracked. And what you're about to hear is the story of how that crack is spreading silently through the foundations of everything you depend on every single day. Your gas, your groceries, your job, the medicine in your cabinet, the phone in your hand. None of them exist in isolation from what is happening in that dark stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And if you think this war is somebody else's problem, happening in somebody else's part of the world, stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never look at a price tag the same way again. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this war, the beginning of the economic trap that made this war so devastating the moment it started. For decades, the world built its energy system around a single assumption, that a 21-mile-wide strait between Iran and Oman would always be open. 21 miles. That's narrower than the English Channel. That's roughly the distance from downtown Manhattan to JFK Airport. And through that 21-mile gap, every single day, flowed approximately 21 million barrels of oil. To put that in perspective, that is 1/5 of all the oil consumed on Earth every 24 hours, passing through a channel so narrow that, on a clear day, you can see both shorelines at the same time. The engineers who designed the global energy economy in the 20th century essentially built the entire structure on top of a single trapdoor. And Iran has always had the key. This is not a secret. Economists, military strategists, and energy analysts have been screaming about the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz for 30 years. There are literally academic papers from the 1980s with titles like "The Hormuz Problem" that describe exactly the kind of catastrophe we are living through right now. The world read those papers, nodded, said, "That's concerning," and then went right back to building more pipelines that ended at Persian Gulf terminals, right back to signing more LNG contracts that routed through Iranian territorial waters, right back to depending more, not less, on that trapdoor staying open. So when Operation Epic Fury, the coordinated US and Israeli airstrike campaign launched on February 28, 2026, killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dismantled Iran's military command structure, the response from Tehran was not just military. It was economic, it was surgical, and it was aimed directly at that trapdoor. Within hours of the strikes, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, issued a navigation prohibition. No vessels permitted in the Strait of Hormuz. Full stop. And unlike previous Iranian threats to close the strait, which had always been rhetorical bluster, this time they backed it up with action. 2 oil tankers were struck by anti-ship missiles within the first 12 hours. A third was boarded and seized by IRGC naval commandos. And then something happened that no energy analyst had fully modeled. The insurance market responded before the military did. Within 48 hours, war risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait did not double or triple. They became functionally unavailable. Insurers at Lloyd's of London suspended new coverage entirely for Persian Gulf transits. And without insurance, no shipping company on Earth, not Maersk, not CMA, CGM, not Hapag-Lloyd, will move a vessel. It doesn't matter what the cargo is. It doesn't matter how much money is on the table. No insurance means no ship moves, period. By March 3rd, the morning our captain cut his engines, tanker traffic through the strait had fallen by approximately 70%. Within another 48 hours, it approached zero. 150 ships were anchored in international waters outside the strait, engines idling, crews watching the news, captains making impossible phone calls. And just like that, the artery that feeds 1/5 of the world's oil consumption had a blood clot in it the size of a war. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Because most people, when they think about a war disrupting oil prices, think about it as a gas price problem. You fill up your car, it costs more, you complain, life goes on. But that framing is roughly as accurate as describing a heart attack as a chest inconvenience. The economic damage being done right now is not primarily about the price at the pump. It is about what oil and gas actually are. They are not just fuel, they are the base ingredient of the entire modern world. Every plastic ever made comes from petrochemicals. Every fertilizer that feeds the 7 billion people who are not growing their own food requires natural gas to produce. The rubber in your tires, the synthetic fabrics in your clothes, the adhesive in your shoes, the insulation in your walls, the packaging around literally everything you buy, all of it traces back to oil and gas. So when you cut off 20% of global oil supply, you're not just making driving more expensive. You're injecting a price shock into the DNA of every manufactured product on Earth. And here is the number that should keep you up at night. The Strait of Hormuz does not just carry oil. It carries approximately 1/3 of the world's fertilizer shipments. 1/3. Sulfur from Saudi Arabia, ammonia from Qatar, urea from the UAE. All of it bound for the farms of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Farms that produce a huge portion of the rice, wheat, and corn that the world's poorest 3 billion people depend on for their daily calories. When those fertilizer shipments stop, not slow down, stop, you do not feel it immediately. You feel it 6 months later when farmers who couldn't afford to fertilize their fields bring in a harvest that is 30, 40, sometimes 50% smaller than normal. You feel it in rising bread prices in Pakistan. You feel it in empty shelves in Bangladesh. You feel it in the kind of food insecurity that historically precedes political instability, which precedes more war, which precedes more economic disruption. You can see how this spirals. You can see exactly how this spirals. But let's stay with the immediate, because the immediate is already alarming enough. On March the 2nd, 2026, Brent crude oil, the global benchmark price, surged from around $70 a barrel to over $80 in a single trading session. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan were already publishing notes suggesting that if the strait closure held for more than 2 weeks, prices could breach $100. And if it extended beyond a month, some models were pointing toward $130, $140 a barrel. Territory not seen since the energy shock of 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent energy markets into a frenzy that took 2 years to unwind. Only this time, the shock is bigger, because this time, it is not just one major supplier disrupted. It is the entire Gulf shipping corridor, simultaneously in both directions. Let's talk about Qatar for a moment, because Qatar is a story that most Western audiences have not fully grasped yet, and it may be the most consequential subplot in this entire economic catastrophe. Qatar is a tiny country, smaller than the state of Connecticut, that has somehow managed to become one of the most important energy suppliers on the planet. Qatar is the world's third largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, shipping LNG to Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and dozens of other countries that rely on it to heat homes, run power plants, and keep industrial machinery operating. And when Iranian missiles struck the Ras Laffan industrial city, Qatar's primary LNG production and export hub, on March 1st, 2026, European natural gas prices nearly doubled in a single day. Nearly doubled. In 24 hours. Think about what that means for a German factory, or a French hospital, or a Dutch greenhouse growing vegetables in winter. Energy is not a discretionary expense for these operations. You cannot simply choose not to heat a hospital in February. You cannot choose not to run the refrigeration systems at a food processing plant. When energy prices double, you either absorb the cost, which means either massive losses or massive price increases passed on to consumers, or you shut down. And already by the first week of March 2026, European energy-intensive industries, steel mills, aluminum smelters, chemical plants, glass manufacturers, were beginning to announce production cuts. Not because they had run out of fuel, because they had run the numbers and determined that at current prices, it cost more to operate than the products were worth. And when factories shut down, workers go home. And when workers go home, they stop spending. And when spending stops, well, you know where that sentence ends. Now let's talk about something that nobody in the mainstream economic commentary has been spending enough time on. Helium. Yes, helium. The same gas that makes balloons float. Qatar is one of the world's 2 primary suppliers of helium, the other being the United States. And Qatar's helium exports have been disrupted by this conflict. You might be asking yourself why that matters. Here is why it matters. Helium is not just for party balloons. Helium is an indispensable coolant in semiconductor manufacturing. When chip fabricators, companies like TSMC, Samsung, and SK Hynix, run the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that etch the microscopic circuits onto your phone's processor, those machines require liquid helium to maintain temperatures close to absolute zero. Without a continuous supply of helium, those machines cannot operate at full capacity. And if chip production slows down, the downstream effects spread across every industry that uses electronics, which is every industry: cars, planes, medical devices, military equipment. Literally, the entire modern economy runs on chips, and chips run on helium, and helium runs through Qatar. And Qatar is currently in the middle of a war zone. This is a domino chain that most people have not begun to think through yet. Meanwhile, in the world's financial markets, the psychological damage has been just as severe as the physical disruption. On March the 2nd, 2026, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 400 points. The S&P 500 dropped 0.7% in a single session. European indices fell 1 to 2% across the board. Asian markets, which had opened before the American exchanges and had more time to process the overnight news from the Gulf, fell even harder. The Nikkei in Tokyo dropped nearly 3%. And buried inside those aggregate numbers are individual stories that tell you exactly where the pain is concentrated. Airline stocks collapsed. Shipping company stocks collapsed. Chemical company stocks collapsed. Fertilizer producer stocks, ironically, the companies that could theoretically benefit from supply constraints driving up prices, if they could actually get their product to market, collapsed because nobody knew whether they could ship anything at all. The only sector that went up was energy. And even there, the gains were complicated, because the same supply disruption that raises oil prices also threatens the infrastructure and shipping lanes that energy companies need to actually deliver that oil. Let's bring this home. Let's talk about you, sitting wherever you are, watching this in America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. Let's talk about the exact mechanism by which a missile strike in the Persian Gulf ends up costing you money. It is not magic. It is not abstract. It is a chain of causation that is almost embarrassingly straightforward once you see it. Oil prices go up. Trucking costs go up immediately because trucks run on diesel. When trucking costs go up, the cost of delivering every single product to every single store goes up. Simultaneously, the petrochemical inputs used to manufacture packaging, plastics, and synthetic materials go up. And at the same time, the energy costs of running the factories, warehouses, and refrigeration units that keep the supply chain moving, all of those go up too. You are not getting a price increase. You are getting 3 simultaneous price increases from 3 different directions, all caused by the same underlying event, all hitting you at the checkout line at exactly the same time. The economists call this a supply shock. You will call it something else when you see your grocery receipt. In the United States, gasoline prices shot to $3.20 a gallon in the days immediately following the conflict, rising 5 to 10 cents per day. And this is before the full supply disruption has worked its way through the system. The lag between a disruption in oil markets and the impact at the pump is typically 2 to 4 weeks, which means that the pain American consumers were feeling in the first week of March was based on what happened before the strait effectively closed. The real wave, the one driven by the actual sustained reduction in oil availability, that wave had not even reached shore yet. When it does, analysts were projecting prices above $4 nationally, with California, which already had the highest gas prices in the nation, potentially approaching $5. And President Trump's response to questions about rising gas prices was, in its own way, a kind of economic admission of helplessness. If they rise, they rise. 4 words that told the American consumer everything they needed to know about the federal government's ability to insulate them from what is coming. And what about the Federal Reserve? Here's the trap the Fed is sitting in right now, and it is a trap with no good exits. The Fed's job is to manage inflation on one side and employment on the other. When inflation goes up because of a supply shock, not because the economy is overheating, but because a war has disrupted the physical availability of energy and goods, the traditional response is to raise interest rates. Higher rates cool demand, which reduces price pressure. But raising rates also slows economic growth, reduces business investment, and increases unemployment. And the United States is already dealing with economic headwinds from the massive tariff increases introduced earlier in 2026, which were themselves inflationary and growth suppressing. So the Fed is being asked to fight war-driven inflation with interest rate tools while simultaneously not tanking an economy that is already fragile from trade war disruption. And doing all of this while a president who has repeatedly and publicly demanded lower interest rates sits in the White House. There's no clean move here. There's no interest rate that solves all of these problems at once. The Fed is essentially being asked to perform surgery on a patient who is simultaneously bleeding and having a heart attack, using tools designed for one condition and not the other. Let's cross the Atlantic. Europe, in many ways, is more exposed to this conflict than the United States. The U.S. has its own massive domestic oil and gas production. It is not energy independent, but it is far less dependent on Persian Gulf supplies than it was 20 years ago. Europe, by contrast, spent the better part of the last decade scrambling to replace Russian energy supplies following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and the replacement it found was, in large part, Qatari LNG. The same Qatari LNG that is now disrupted. So Europe is being asked to absorb an energy supply shock while it is still recovering from the previous energy supply shock that nearly broke its industrial economy 4 years ago. The German economy, already the sick man of Europe after years of deindustrialization, high energy costs and supply chain vulnerabilities, is particularly exposed. Germany runs on industrial production runs on energy, and Germany's energy situation in March 2026 is roughly analogous to a patient who just finished chemotherapy being asked to run a marathon. The body is not ready, the reserves are not there, and a prolonged conflict in the Gulf will push the German economy, and by extension the entire Eurozone, into the kind of recession that takes years to climb out of. Bloomberg Economics was not subtle about the stakes. Their analysts warned in the first week of March that the Iran war threatens to deal a severe blow to a global economy already strained by historic tariff levels. For Europe, sustained high energy prices would push the economy to the brink of recession. For the developing world, for the countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America that are least able to absorb energy and food price shocks, the threat is not recession. The threat is genuine humanitarian crisis. And here is something else you need to understand about the shipping dimension of this crisis, because it is not just the Strait of Hormuz that is the problem. It is the combination of the Strait of Hormuz closure and the already compromised Suez Canal corridor. For the past 2 years, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea had already forced many major shipping lines to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 12 to 14 days to transit times between Asia and Europe, and adding approximately $1 million in fuel costs per voyage. That rerouting had already inflated shipping costs significantly, and supply chain managers had spent the better part of 2025 trying to adapt to this new reality. And now, simultaneously, the Persian Gulf itself, the origin point for energy shipments and a critical node for manufactured goods moving between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, has effectively been closed. This is not a single choke point crisis. This is a dual choke point crisis. And the shipping industry, which had never modeled both happening at the same time, is in a state of genuine confusion about how to respond. As of early March 2026, approximately 170 container ships carrying an estimated 450,000 containers were stranded in the Persian Gulf. Those containers held everything from consumer electronics to automotive parts to pharmaceutical ingredients to grain, and they were going nowhere. The major carriers, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, had suspended Persian Gulf transits entirely. The ships that could reroute were rerouting, adding thousands of miles and weeks of transit time. The ships that were already inside the Gulf were anchored and waiting, burning fuel and accumulating costs while their cargoes sat, and the companies on the receiving end began running out of stock. Let's talk about those pharmaceutical ingredients for a moment, because this is one of the less discussed but potentially most serious dimensions of the supply disruption. A significant portion of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the chemical compounds that actually make medicines work, used in drugs sold in America and Europe are manufactured in India. India's pharmaceutical export infrastructure relies heavily on shipping routes through the Arabian Sea and into the Persian Gulf corridor. When that corridor is disrupted, the supply of pharmaceutical raw materials to factories in the United States and Europe is disrupted. Not immediately. There are buffer stocks, there are inventories. But if the disruption extends for weeks or months, those buffers run down, and the medicines that run short are not going to be the blockbuster drugs made by pharmaceutical giants with diversified supply chains and massive inventory reserves. They are going to be the generic drugs, the cheap, essential medications that millions of people rely on every day for blood pressure, diabetes, mental health, and pain management, the ones with thin profit margins and lean supply chains, the ones nobody ever thinks about until they can't get them. Now let's step back and look at the macro picture one more time, because I want you to really feel the scale of what we are talking about. The global economy in 2026 was already navigating one of the most complex and treacherous environments in modern history. You had historic levels of debt in major economies. You had the aftershocks of the COVID era, supply chain reconfiguration still working through the system. You had a trade war, featuring tariffs at levels not seen since the Great Depression, actively disrupting the flow of goods between the world's two largest economies. You had persistently elevated inflation in many parts of the world that had not fully returned to pre-pandemic levels. And into this already fragile situation, this patient who was already weakened, already stressed, already carrying too many pre-existing conditions, you drop a war that simultaneously disrupts energy supplies, food commodity supplies, shipping infrastructure, financial markets, and the aviation network connecting the world's fastest growing regional economy. The question is not whether this hurts. The question is how much and for how long. Oxford Economics, one of the world's most respected economic forecasting firms, ran the scenarios. In the best case, a short, contained conflict resolved within weeks with the strait reopening to commercial traffic by late March. The global economic damage is significant but manageable. A modest uptick in inflation, a slight reduction in growth projections, some disruption to specific supply chains, higher energy bills for consumers and businesses for a quarter or two. Painful, but not catastrophic. In the medium case, a conflict that drags on for several months with the strait closure maintained through the spring planting season, you're looking at food price inflation in developing countries, a probable recession in Europe, significant growth reduction in Asia, and a United States that enters the second half of 2026 in a considerably weaker position than anyone had projected. And in the worst case, a conflict that escalates, draws in other regional powers, and results in long-term damage to energy infrastructure across the Gulf. You are looking at an economic scenario that the models genuinely struggle to quantify, because it involves the kind of systemic shock that modern economic forecasting tools were not designed to handle. The EY Parthenon chief economist Gregory Dacko put the stakes clearly. Before this conflict began, his firm had forecast solid U.S. economic growth of around 2.4% for 2026. A short-lived conflict would shave a modest fraction off that, but a longer-lasting, broader escalation would shrink the anticipated expansion by more than half. And half of 2.4% is 1.2%, which, combined with the existing tariff headwinds and elevated inflation, is the kind of number that puts you uncomfortably close to zero. And zero growth with elevated inflation is a word that economists have a name for. That word is stagflation. And stagflation is the one economic condition that standard policy tools genuinely cannot fix. Because the medicine for slow growth, stimulus, is poison for inflation, and the medicine for inflation, tightening, is poison for growth. If we get there, we are in a situation where the economic toolkit has no clean answers, and the people who suffer most are, as always, the ones with the least cushion to absorb the shock. Here is something worth sitting with. The 10% of the world's population who live in extreme poverty, roughly 800 million people, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, consume an essentially negligible share of the world's oil. They do not drive cars, they do not fly on planes. Many of them do not even have reliable electricity. Their carbon footprint is nearly zero. They did not start this war. They played no part in the geopolitical decisions that led to it. They have no influence over the military or economic policies of the United States, Israel, or Iran. And yet they are disproportionately the ones who will feel the consequences of it most severely. Through rising food prices driven by fertilizer shortages, through reduced aid budgets as donor countries face domestic economic pressures, through the cascading instability that follows when food prices spike in already fragile societies. This is one of the oldest and most infuriating patterns in modern geopolitics. The people who make the decisions are insulated from the consequences. The people who bear the consequences had no say in the decisions. Let's come back to the tech dimension one more time, because it connects to something that feels very close to home for a lot of people watching this. The war has disrupted, at least temporarily, some of the most ambitious artificial intelligence infrastructure projects ever announced. Amazon Web Services had facilities in Dubai and Bahrain, facilities that sustained drone strike damage in the first days of the conflict. Samsung and SK Hynix had recently signed massive contracts to supply memory chips for the Stargate AI data center project in the UAE, one of the largest AI infrastructure investments outside the United States. When you disrupt a region that has become a hub for data center investment, you do not just slow down the tech industry in that region. You slow down the timeline for AI development globally, because the training of large AI models requires enormous amounts of compute power. And that compute power requires data centers, and those data centers require a stable operating environment. Wars and data centers do not mix well. And then there is the aviation story, which deserves more attention than it has been getting. The closure of airspace over the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, combined with missile strikes that damaged runways at Dubai International and Abu Dhabi airports, led to the cancellation of more than 4,000 flights per day in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. 4,000 flights per day, stranding hundreds of thousands of passengers and disrupting cargo operations on a massive scale. Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways, three of the world's most profitable and operationally sophisticated airlines, which had spent decades building the Gulf into one of the world's great aviation hubs, were effectively grounded. And the business model of the Gulf hub airports is not just about connecting the Gulf to the world. It is about serving as the transit point between Europe and Asia, the layover that makes the long-haul route economical. When that hub disappears, even temporarily, it does not just inconvenience travelers. It raises the cost of moving people and goods between continents. It adds hours to journeys and dollars to tickets. And over time, if the disruption persists, it forces a rethinking of the entire architecture of long-haul aviation, which has been quietly built over decades and around the assumption that the Gulf hubs will always be available. Here is the deeper question. Here is the thing that the economic data is pointing toward, but that requires a human voice to say clearly. The Iran war has exposed something that the global economy has been desperately trying to ignore for decades. We have built an extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily efficient, and extraordinarily fragile system. The efficiency was the point. Globalization promised and delivered the elimination of waste, goods made where they were cheapest, shipped where they were needed, financed at the lowest available cost, insured against the most predictable risks, just-in-time manufacturing, lean supply chains, global commodities markets that could price a barrel of oil or a bushel of wheat to within fractions of a cent based on the aggregated judgment of thousands of traders. It was a marvel of human coordination, and its fatal flaw was resilience, or rather, the lack of it. A system optimized for efficiency is, almost by definition, not optimized for shocks. You cannot run a lean supply chain and a resilient supply chain simultaneously. They are, at their core, in tension with each other. And the past several years, the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping, and now this, have been a relentless series of lessons in what happens when the shocks come faster than the optimization can adapt. The economic historians of the future will look at this period and see it as the moment when the great globalization experiment began its most serious stress test. Not its end. Globalization will not end because of the Iran war. Supply chains will eventually reroute. New energy partnerships will be formed. Markets will find new equilibria. The human capacity for adaptation is genuinely extraordinary, and markets, for all their flaws, are extraordinarily good at finding ways around obstacles when the incentives are strong enough. But the cost of this adaptation is not nothing. It is measured in the grocery bills that go up and do not come back down. It is measured in the factory workers in Germany and Japan who lose their jobs during a production shutdown and do not get them back. It is measured in the harvest yields in Pakistan and Bangladesh that fall short this year and next year and the year after, because the fertilizer never arrived in time for planting season. And it is measured in something else, something harder to quantify, but arguably more important than any of the numbers we have been discussing. It is measured in the erosion of trust. Trust in the stability of the systems that the modern world depends on. Trust in the ability of governments and international institutions to maintain the conditions that allow global trade to function. Trust in the idea that the complex, interdependent economy we have built is durable enough to withstand the shocks that human history, with its wars and conflicts and catastrophes, will inevitably keep producing. That trust, once damaged, is slow to repair, and it shapes decisions, investment decisions, supply chain decisions, energy policy decisions that will affect the global economy for a generation. So where does this leave us? Here is the honest answer: in a deeply uncertain place. The economic modeling depends entirely on variables that no model can reliably predict. How long the conflict lasts, whether it escalates or de-escalates, whether the strait remains closed for weeks or months, whether Iran's leadership structure stabilizes or fractures further, whether other regional actors are drawn into the fighting. Each of those variables in each direction produces a radically different economic outcome. What is not uncertain is the direction of the risk. Every scenario analysis points the same way. The economic damage from this conflict is real, it is significant, and it is not over. The immediate market reactions, the oil price surge, the stock market sell-offs, the insurance market withdrawal, are the canary in the coal mine. The deeper, slower-moving economic damage, the supply chain disruptions, the food price increases, the industrial production cuts, the investment slowdowns, that is the coal mine itself. And most of it has not yet made its way through the system. The captain of that cargo ship, anchored in the dark waters outside the Strait of Hormuz at 4:47 a.m. on March 3, 2026, made the only rational decision available to him. He turned back. He protected his crew, his vessel, and his cargo from a situation that had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too expensive to navigate. He made a sensible, practical, local decision. And somewhere in the compound effect of hundreds of captains making that same sensible, practical, local decision, all at the same time, all for perfectly rational reasons, lies the mechanism by which a war in the Middle East quietly becomes everybody's economic problem, not through any great conspiracy, not through any single dramatic event, but through the invisible arithmetic of a globalized world where every individual rational choice adds up to a collective consequence that nobody chose and nobody wanted. That is how the Iran war is breaking the global economy, not with a single explosion, with 1,000 engines going quiet one by one in the dark.